Hello, welcome to this short video which provides a brief introduction to the topic of British literature. You may have heard of a country called England, situated on an island in northwestern Europe. All countries are interesting in their own ways, but the literary history of England is particularly relevant to people who speak the English language, since, as you probably know, the English language developed and evolved in England over the course of the last 1,000 years or so. Throughout much of the second half of that millennium, England became the hub of one of the largest global empires in human history. And while the British Empire has been substantially reduced since the end of World War II, English customs, political structures, and cultural values have been extremely influential in the modern histories of countries as diverse and far-flung as Australia, Jamaica, Canada, India, Iraq, Jordan, Papua New Guinea, Libya, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Singapore, Hong Kong, and of course, the United States. For these reasons, the study of British literature is more than the study of the literary history of some random country. The history of British literature informs the way the English language, the most widely spoken second language in the world, the language most commonly used as an international language of business, science, and politics, came to be what it is today. Not only a vocabulary and grammar, but also a network of embedded allusions to the way the language has been used over the last 1,000 years by people who used it to express themselves and who, in the act of doing so, shaped the way speakers of English would go on to use it around the world. The political history of England is a vast and tangled subject of study, and fortunately, this class will not require you to know very much about it. People have been living on the island of Great Britain for at least 500,000 years. The earliest group of inhabitants most people know about are the Neolithic people who built Stonehenge about 3,500 years ago. But that's still much further back than where we're picking up the story. There were Celtic people there about 2,000 years ago who were conquered by the Romans, and when the Roman Empire fell a few hundred years later, the island was raided and invaded and settled by Scandinavian Vikings, known as Angles and Saxons. These Anglo-Saxons brought their Proto-Germanic language with them, and by the time the Beowulf poet sits down around 1000 AD to tell the Danish stories of his ancestors, their language had morphed and changed, as languages are always doing. It was now something we call Old English. The important takeaway from this synopsis is that the England of 1,000 years ago, like many other places 1,000 years ago, was steeped in a history of conflict, violence, insecurity, and war. And it wasn't over. Within a few generations after the Beowulf poet wrote his Old English epic in 1066, William the Conqueror invaded Great Britain and France and conquered the Anglo-Saxons in a cultural clash that would go on to transform English culture and language in profound ways. For one thing, as you may have noticed, just about every word in the English language can be categorized as either an Anglo-Saxon word or a French word. Anglo-Saxon words tend to be plain-spoken, regular, everyday words, the words of the farmer and peasant. Cow, sky, mother, tree. Since the ruling class following the Norman invasion spoke French, French-based words to this day are fancier and more aristocratic or intellectual. Beef, firmament, maternal relation, arbor. Another effect of the Norman conquest was that the English language was driven underground. For hundreds of years, it was devalued as the parlance, French word, of the plain folk, Anglo-Saxon word, and no official authority kept track of its grammar rules, its correct spellings, or used English in writing. The result is that the language lost a lot of the complex grammatical features of gender, case, and inflection that characterized Old English, and that still characterize many Germanic and Romantic languages. You may have heard that English is a difficult language to learn because it has strange spellings like through for through and knight for night. Most of these strange spellings, like these two examples, are holdovers from the way these words were pronounced in Old English. But if you ever tried to conjugate an irregular verb in German, or tried to read a language with no vowels like Hebrew, or tried to remember whether a table was supposed to be male or female in French, let alone tried to learn how to read ideographs in Chinese, then you can appreciate how streamlined English grammar became as a result of its relegation to underclass status during a time when poor people lived in a house, which is Anglo-Saxon word, while rich people lived in a mansion, which is a French word. To this day, of course, regular folk have jobs and eat food, while fancy people have careers and eat cuisine. But at least we don't have to remember if the food is male or female, or even, in some languages, neuter. When people start writing in English again, around 1400, it has changed enough that historians now call it Middle English. For many people writing at this time, writing in English was a kind of rebellious act, celebrating the common people and their slightly vulgar but always colorful and earthy language. In morality and miracle plays, which were written to bring biblical instruction to illiterate English speakers, the plain spoken and humble English language translates the divine mysteries, which according to the Roman Catholic theology of the day are really meant to be expressed only in Latin, into the simple idiom of illiterate farmers. In Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the writer's inventive and unapologetic use of the English language becomes a celebration of the ordinary people who speak it, the pilgrims, rogues, businessmen, and boors, whose voices and stories he devotes himself to showcasing. In this way, many Middle English writers associated their English language with a spirit of democracy. It was the language of the people, the language of anti-establishment sentiment. While a strong central monarchy has always been a major feature of British political culture since the Middle Ages, England is perhaps paradoxically also the place where contemporary values of democracy, political representation, and popular suffrage were originally theorized and put into political practice in at least a partial way that would serve as a foundation for more radical experiments in self-governance, like those implemented by the founding fathers of the United States, who basically copied the British judicial and bicameral legislative systems and replaced a sovereign king with an elected president. England was the first European country to vote to have their king's head cut off in 1649, and the ideals of independence and human rights that led to that event, and in some ways to subsequent revolutionary movements in Haiti, France, Mexico, India, and of course again the United States, can be traced in the history of the English language and the way the language has been used. In the early modern period, around 1600 AD or so, the British Empire has defeated Spain to establish itself as the supreme world power, and at this point, its language stabilizes into basically the language English speakers use today. Around this time, the most influential English-speaking person ever to live, William Shakespeare, used the English language to compose plays and poetry that are often considered to represent the highest linguistic achievement in the history of any language. Shakespeare's language might sound a little strange to modern readers who are unfamiliar with it, but it is modern English. The vocabulary, the grammar, and even most of the spellings are equivalent to modern usages. There are different ways to think about what has sometimes been called the cult of Shakespeare. On the one hand, it is undeniable that the legend of Shakespeare's greatness has been used as a kind of propaganda tool to signify British supremacy and justify imperial acts of predation and oppression. If there was a Bangladeshi Shakespeare, he may never have learned to read or write. If there was a Jamaican Shakespeare, he was probably worked to death on a sugar plantation. A Shakespeare born in Ireland at the same time as English Shakespeare might have been gunned down in the streets by the king's soldiers, or starved to death by deliberately anti-Irish economic policies. English Shakespeare had the good fortune to live at the center of the empire, what is known as the metropole, London, where all the wealth that got scooped out of the colonial possessions got deposited, leaving lots of money for fancy gloves — Shakespeare's father was a successful maker of gloves — and theater tickets. Since all art is subjective, you might argue the myth of Shakespeare's genius is just a colonial boondoggle meant to make everyone think that English people are smarter than everyone else. On the other hand, have you ever read Shakespeare? The level of verbal complexity, the empathy and imagination, the humor and pathos, these qualities of Shakespeare's writing can legitimately be considered one of the signature miracles of human consciousness. Shakespeare's use of language to summon up plots, characters, and complexes of feeling have inspired generations of thinkers and writers around the world and across languages to become a kind of shared human resource that we all have in common. How much of Shakespeare's cultural status is a result of British imperial propaganda, and how much of it is due to Shakespeare's inherent greatness, we may never be able to say for sure. But for whatever reason, Shakespeare enjoys a unique place in literary history. In the context of British literature, his work can be thought about as the moment when the English language, drawing on its rich and convoluted history, comes into its own as a global language capable of pyrotechnic displays of verbal and conceptual potency. In the context of world literature, Shakespeare's work is an intercultural treasure, something that speaks beyond languages and beyond borders and histories, to speak to elemental human truths that bring us all together. So there are a lot of reasons why studying British literature is worthwhile. Reasons having to do with the history of the English language, the emergence of global geopolitical culture, and the investigation into the question of how literary works function as expressions of cultural energies, vehicles of political ideologies, and windows into how ways of thinking and feeling have remained constant over centuries, as well as how they have changed. To me, however, the best reason to study British literature is that it is beautiful and strange and funny. I hope by the end of this class you will become familiar enough with the texts under discussion to be able to appreciate how beautiful, strange, and funny they are.